The river bent quiet through the prairie that evening, its slow waters catching the last light of the Sunday. Jesse Hale rode along its edge, reins loose in his hand, his eyes scanning the ground out of habit more than need. He was a man used to watching the land, used to catching the small signs of change that others missed, and that was why he noticed the pale shape lying half in the water. At first he thought it a log washed down from the hills, but when his horse snorted and stepped sideways he saw the truth. A woman lay there, her dress torn and clinging to her, her face turned to the sky, her hair spread like weeds along the current. For a moment Jesse just sat in the saddle, the sound of the river louder than his own breath. Then he swung down, boots sinking in the damp earth, and knelt beside her. Her skin was cold, her lips cracked, her cheek bruised as if she had met a cruel hand. He touched her shoulder gently, expecting no answer, but her eyes fluttered open. They were empty, wide and hollow, like she had stared too long at something that had stolen the soul out of her. Jesse spoke low, as if to a spooked horse, telling her she was safe, telling her he meant no harm. She did not answer. Her lips moved once, a soundless shape, and then her head rolled weakly toward the water again. Jesse glanced up and down the bank. No wagon, no camp, no horse tracks, nothing but her and the river. Whoever left her here had done so to be rid of her, and whoever she was, she had no strength left to save herself. Jesse slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her with care, though she weighed little more than a bundle of sticks. She did not fight, did not cling, only sagged against him as if every ounce of will had drained away. He laid her across his horse, covering her with his coat, though it was near the end of summer, and swung up behind. The horse shifted but steadied at Jesse's hand, used to carrying more than one burden on its back. Jesse held her close so she would not slide off, her head against his chest, her breath faint but still there. The prairie stretched wide and silent, the sky turning purple as night came on, and Jesse rode steady toward his cabin. His mind turned over questions, but none found answers. Who was she? What had she fled? What had she been forced to endure? Yet one thought pressed hardest in his chest, the simple knowledge that leaving her would have been the same as killing her. A sin worse than death, he thought, to pass by a soul left broken on the river's edge and do nothing. He tightened his arm around her as the horse carried them into the dark. A nameless girl, and the man who had found her, bound now by chance and the weight of mercy. The horse moved steady along the worn trail, its hooves thudding against the hard ground as the sun dipped behind the hills. Jesse kept his arm firm around the girl, feeling the tremor in her body even under his coat. She was awake now, not strong enough to speak, but her eyes were open, staring straight ahead at the horizon, as if the distance could give her answers. Jesse tried a few words, gentle questions asked in the low tone he used when breaking a nervous colt. Where had she come from? Did she have family nearby? What was her name? Each time he spoke, she gave no answer, only blinked once and turned her face away, her silence louder than any refusal. The wind carried the smell of dust and pine, the prairie stretched wide and empty, and he felt the weight of her quiet pressing between them. He studied her when she did not notice, the lines of her face marked not only by dirt and bruises, but by something deeper, a sorrow carved long before the river had nearly claimed her. Her lips were chapped, her hair tangled, her cheekbones sharp from hunger, yet it was the scar that caught him most, a thin pale mark running along her temple just above her brow, hidden in part by her hair. It was not fresh, but healed in a crooked way, as if whatever blow had given it might have stolen more than flesh. Jesse wondered if that was why her eyes seemed hollow, if her memory had been struck clean away by violence. The trail wound through cottonwoods, where the river narrowed, and the air grew cool in the shade. The girl shivered against him, though he had wrapped her in his coat, and he shifted his arm to steady her closer. She did not fight, did not lean either, only allowed herself to be held like one who had long since stopped expecting kindness. Jesse felt a tug in his chest at that, an ache he had not carried since the war, when he had seen too many faces like hers, too many souls emptied out by what they had lived through. Night gathered slow, and the lantern Jesse carried swung from his saddle horn, throwing a soft glow on the path. The girl's gaze followed the light, but never lingered. When the horse climbed the last ridge before his land, Jesse tried again. He told her his name, plain and steady, Jesse Hale. Still no answer. He said she was safe now, that she would have food and rest at his place. Her lips moved faintly, but no sound came. He almost thought she was trying to form a word, but it slipped away before it reached the air. The cabin came into view at last, a lonely shape of logs and stone set against the wide field. Smoke curled faint from the chimney, the scent of wood fire mixing with the night breeze. Jesse guided the horse into the yard, his arms still tight around her small frame. As he swung down and lifted her once more into his arms, he felt how light she was, as if the river had already washed most of her away. He promised her softly that she was safe, though he knew promises were fragile things. She gave no sign she had heard, her silence still heavier than words. But for the first time since he found her, she closed her eyes, as if trust, however small, had begun to stir. The night had turned sharp by the time Jesse carried her through the cabin door, the wind pushing against the walls as if trying to follow them inside. He set her gently on the narrow bed near the fire, the glow of the flames throwing long shadows across the room. The girl did not speak, did not resist, only watched him with hollow eyes that seemed too old for her face. Jesse moved with a steady calm, lighting another lantern, hanging his coat to dry, setting a pot of water to warm on the hearth. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice stayed even, the tone of a man who knew the weight of silence and did not fear it. He fetched a basin and cloth, kneeling beside her as if she were fragile enough to break. She flinched at the first touch of water on her skin, but she did not pull away. Dirt and river silt washed down her cheek, revealing the bruise beneath, a deep purple swelling at her temple that made Jesse's jaw tighten. He cleaned her face, her hands, the worst of the scrapes along her arms. When he asked if she hurt anywhere else, she only shook her head, her eyes slipping away from his as though the question itself carried shame. From a shelf he drew a small jar of salve, the kind he had learned to make in winter for frostbite and burns. He dabbed it gently over the bruise, speaking almost to himself, saying how it would ease the ache, how it would help the skin heal. She followed his hands with her gaze but gave no reply. When he was done, he set the jar aside and stood, crossing the room to ladle broth from a kettle that had simmered since morning. He placed the bowl on the small table near the bed and nudged it toward her. The smell of beef and onion filled the cabin, soft and homely against the storm outside. She stared at the bowl for a long while before lifting the spoon with a hand that trembled. Jesse said nothing, only sat in the chair by the fire and watched the flames climb the wood. She ate slow, each swallow heavy, as though she had forgotten how to take in food. When she was finished, she set the spoon down without a word. He took the bowl, cleaned it, and returned to his seat. The fire cracked, the wind whistled, and the room filled with a quiet that was not empty but waiting. At last Jesse spoke, his eyes on the flames. He asked her name, soft as the ember glow. She looked at him then, her mouth opening once, then closing. Finally she shook her head, the smallest motion, a refusal without anger. Jesse gave a slow nod. "Then we'll wait," he said quietly, as if the words themselves were a promise. She pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders and lowered her gaze, but the firelight caught a glint in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something near it, something that might one day be. The days stretched quiet, marked only by the rhythm of chores and the slow healing of wounds. Jesse rose early as always, tending the stock, hauling water, cutting wood for the fire. Yet now there was another presence in the cabin, a presence that filled the silence even when no word was spoken. The girl remained mostly inside, wrapped in the quilt he had given her body still too weak for more than a few steps at a time. At night the quiet broke. her sleep haunted by cries she tried to smother with her hands or bury into the pillow. Jesse heard her, though the walls were thin, and he would stir from his cot, not entering her space, only rising to feed the fire or sit by the table until the storm in her passed. He did not press her, did not ask, because he knew there were some battles a soul had to fight alone before they could let another near. In the mornings he found her seated on the porch, the quilt pulled tight, her eyes cast far across the prairie. The land stretched endless before them, golden grass bending in the wind, the river glinting silver in the distance. She stared as though the earth itself might whisper her name, as though the horizon could return to her the pieces she had lost. Jesse would step around her softly, boots thudding on the boards, sometimes setting a tin cup of coffee by her side, sometimes just tipping his hat before moving on with his chores. She accepted his small offerings with a nod, but her gaze never left the wide country. He noticed how she carried herself even in stillness, shoulders drawn tight, hands clenched in her lap, as though braced for a blow that never came. The scar on her temple caught the light whenever the wind pushed her hair back, and Jesse wondered again what memory it had stolen. She spoke no words, though now and then her lips parted as if she wanted to, then pressed shut again, trapped by fear or shame. Jesse did not try to fill the silence with questions, knowing too well how silence itself could be a kind of medicine. One evening, he sat beside her, the sky painted red with the sinking Sunday. He smoked his pipe in easy rhythm, letting the smoke drift above them. After a long while, he said he had lost his own brother once, the war taking him and leaving nothing but an empty name on a stone. He told it plain, no weight added, just a truth shared to the open air. She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching his, and for the briefest moment the shadows lifted, not gone, but eased by the knowledge that someone else carried grief too. She did not speak, but she did not turn away either. When night came, she returned to the bed by the fire, clutching the quilt as always. Jesse lay on his cot, listening to the wind beat against the cabin, thinking how fragile she seemed, yet how much strength it must have taken to survive whatever road had brought her to the river. He knew better than to expect her trust quickly, but he also knew he would wait as long as it took, because in the shadows of her eyes he saw a fight not yet finished, and a soul that deserved a chance to heal. The morning was clear when Jesse saddled his horse and told the girl they would ride into town for supplies. She hesitated at first, clutching the edge of the porch rail, as if the thought of leaving the cabin set the world spinning under her feet. But Jesse's steady voice, and the quiet patience in his eyes, finally brought her forward. He lifted her gently into the saddle before swinging up behind, his arm secure around her slight frame, as the horse carried them down the dusty trail toward the cluster of buildings that marked the town. The streets were half alive when they arrived, wagons creaking, children running loose, women with baskets calling to one another. But as Jesse reined the horse near the store, the noise bent quiet. Eyes turned, sharp and measuring, resting not on him but on the girl wrapped in his coat. Whispers stirred like wind through dry grass. "A runaway," someone muttered. Another said she looked like a whore taken off the trail. A third guessed thief. Voice low but pointed, and though none spoke it to Jesse's face, the weight of their stares pressed hard. The girl bowed her head, her hair falling forward to shield her face, but it did not block the heat rising in her chest. Shame burned her throat, though she had done nothing. Shame born of too many years of knowing what it was to be judged before a word was spoken. She gripped the saddle horn tighter, willing her hands not to shake, wishing the ground might open and take her away from those eyes. Jesse dismounted, his expression calm though his jaw had tightened, and reached up to help her down. He set her on her feet and kept his hand light at her back as they walked toward the store. The crowd's gaze followed, and one woman near the steps pulled her child close, as if fear could be caught like sickness. The girl felt herself shrink smaller with each step, her shoulders curling inward, but Jesse's hand stayed steady, guiding her forward without hurry. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour and leather, safe from the eyes outside. But it was not long before the door swung open and the sheriff stepped in. A broad man with a thinning mustache, he carried himself with the weight of authority. His eyes swept over Jesse, then landed on the girl, narrowing with suspicion. He asked Jesse if he knew what kind of trouble he was leading into his jurisdiction, said he would not have strays and runaways stirring unrest among decent folk. His words were plain, but laced with warning. Jesse met his gaze without blinking, and said he was only here for flour, sugar, and nails, nothing more. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then spat into the corner and muttered that he best keep it that way. He left with the heavy step of a man satisfied he had reminded the world who held power. When the door closed behind him, the girl let out a breath she had been holding, her chest aching from it. She looked at Jesse then, searching for anger or shame in his face, but found only calm steadiness. He paid for the supplies, gathered the goods, and offered her his arm as if nothing in the world had changed. Outside, the whispers rose again, but Jesse lifted her onto the horse without hesitation, his voice low as he told her to keep her eyes on the horizon, not on the people who could not see past their own fear. She nodded, still shaken. Yet as the horse carried them away from the town, she felt the fire in her chest cool, knowing at least one man refused to bow to the world's sneers. The town was restless that day, the saloon spilling noise and smoke into the street as Jesse led the girl past. He had only meant to stop for feed and a coil of rope, but the saloon doors swung open and a handful of men stumbled out, half-drunk and eager for amusement. Their eyes fell on her, the way vultures find the weakest thing in sight. One leaned against the post and grinned wide, asking Jesse what he was doing, hauling around a stray like her. Another laughed, his voice rough with whiskey, saying she didn't even have a name, calling her, no, name, as if it were a joke worth sharing. The others picked it up, repeating it loud enough for her to hear, their laughter sharp like stones thrown at a stray dog. She flinched at the word but did not speak, her hands tight around the edge of Jesse's coat, her chin lowered so her hair hid her face. The shame that had followed her since the river rose again, pressing into her chest until it hurt to breathe. Jesse stepped between her and the men, his hand resting near the holster on his hip, his eyes hard, though his voice stayed level. He told them to mind their own and keep their tongues still. One of the men muttered something under his breath, but Jesse's steady gaze cut it short. The girl felt him guide her away, his touch firm and protective, and though the laughter still rang behind them, she let him lead her back to the horse without looking up. The ride home was silent. The prairie spread wide and golden, the sky fading to dusk, but she saw none of it. The word clung to her ears, heavier than the sound of the wind. No, name. It had not been meant as truth, only cruelty, yet it wrapped around her like chains. She pressed her face into the horse's mane to hide the tears that burned her eyes. Jesse said nothing, but she felt his arm draw her closer, as if he knew the weight she carried. That night the cabin was quiet but for the crackle of the fire. Jesse set the goods on the shelf, hung his hat, and finally knelt by the hearth, his face lit by the glow. She sat curled in the chair, the quilt around her, her eyes fixed on the floor. He watched her, a long moment before speaking, his voice low and even. He told her she didn't have to stay nameless, didn't have to carry the words others threw at her. He said people in town would call her what made them feel big, but she was not bound to their mockery. She lifted her eyes then, the firelight catching the raw ache in them. For the first time she believed he meant it. He added softly that when she was ready, she could choose a name for herself, and until then he would call her nothing she did not want. She pressed the quilt tighter around her, the chains of the day loosening just enough for her to draw a breath without pain. The night had settled heavy over the prairie, the kind of darkness that seemed to press against the windows and make the small cabin feel like the only place left in the world. The fire burned low, casting soft light across the rough walls, its crackle steady against the hush of wind outside. Jesse sat in his chair, his boots stretched toward the hearth. the pipe in his hand unlit, as he watched the flames shift and fall. The girl lay curled on the bed nearby, the quilt pulled close to her chin, her face half hidden in shadow. She had not spoken since the day he found her. Not a name, not a word, only silence that carried weight like a stone tied to her. He had grown used to it, answering her quiet with patience, never pressing her for what she could not yet give. But that night he heard it, faint at first, so faint he almost thought it the pop of the wood. A single word, broken on her lips, whispered into the air as if she had not meant it to escape. Please. It was not loud, not sharp, but it held more power than any speech. It carried the ache of all she had borne, the fear she still carried, the memories that rose like shadows each time she closed her eyes. Jesse looked over, his chest tightening at the sight of her clutching the quilt so fiercely her knuckles whitened. Her body trembled, though the room was warm. Her face twisted, as though she fought to push back whatever nightmare had followed her into waking. He did not rise fast, did not startle her with sudden movement. He only leaned forward, steady and calm, and placed another log on the fire. The flames caught and grew, the glow stretching warmer across the cabin. He spoke no words, because none were needed. His presence was his answer, the quiet promise that she was not alone. She turned her head slightly, her eyes glinting wet in the firelight, watching him through strands of tangled hair. He met her gaze without question, only with the same patience he had carried since the river. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of two people holding something fragile between them, a trust too small to name, but too real to deny. She loosened her grip on the quilt at last, her fingers trembling as they relaxed, and her breathing slowed, though the tears still shone on her cheek. Jesse leaned back again, settling into his chair, his eyes never leaving the fire, giving her space to gather herself. The word hung in the room like smoke, soft but lasting. Please. It was not her name, not her story, not even something he could answer outright, yet it was more than she had given anyone since the river. Jesse let it rest there, unchallenged, knowing it had cost her more than most people would ever understand. He reached out, shifted the kettle closer to the coals, and poured hot water into a tin cup. He set it on the table where she could reach it if she wished. She did not move, only watched. But the faintest ease showed in her eyes, as if the simple act had answered the plea she could not explain. The fire crackled on, the shadows pressed close, but in that cabin she was no longer voiceless. She had spoken, and Jesse had heard. The sun was high when Jesse rode into the small settlement with the girl at his side, a trip made only because supplies were running low and the cabin shelves sat bare. The street was quiet, a few wagons drawn up by the store, the saloon doors hanging crooked on their hinges. Jesse tied the horse and stepped down, steadying the girl as her feet touched the ground. She had walked with more strength these days, though her silence still wrapped around her like a cloak. He thought the stares of townsfolk were hard enough, but what came next carried a weight heavier than whispers. A man leaned against the water trough, a drifter with dust on his boots and whiskey on his breath. His eyes caught the girl and narrowed sharp, and before Jesse could move him along he let out a low curse. He spat in the dirt and said a name that Jesse did not recognize, but the girl did. Her body stiffened, her face draining pale, her hands trembling as if that single word had cut her deeper than any blade. The drifter laughed harshly and said he had seen her before, said she was tied to the outlaws who had raided a wagon train not far from the river weeks back. He spoke of fire and screaming, of wagons burned to ash and families scattered. And with each word the girl shrank smaller, her eyes wide with the terror of being seen. Jesse stepped between them, his hand hovering near his holster, his voice low and hard, as he told the man to keep his tongue. The drifter only sneered and muttered that Jesse ought to know who he was keeping under his roof, then staggered off toward the saloon, leaving dust and poison in his wake. Jesse turned to the girl. but she would not meet his eyes. Her lips moved faintly as though she wanted to deny it, but no sound came. She shook her head once, then again, yet the trembling of her hands betrayed her. She could not claim the truth, but she could not throw it away either. Jesse led her back to the horse, without another word, his jaw tight as he lifted her into the saddle. The ride home was long and silent, the trail stretching endless under the sun, but his mind turned over the drifter's words again and again. If it were true, if she had been tied in some way to that raid, then the shadows in her eyes were not only grief but guilt. Yet the way she had collapsed at the river, half drowned and near death, told a story of its own. He could not see her as a raider, not with the way she flinched at cruelty, not with the way she whispered pleas in the dark like a prayer. That night by the fire he watched her sit apart, her face hidden by her hair, her body curled in on itself as if she feared he might cast her out. Jesse said nothing, but his heart carried the weight of the mark she bore, the mark of violence that tied her past to blood. He knew the truth was darker than either of them had guessed, but he also knew this much. He had pulled her from the river, and whatever shadow followed her, he would not let it drag her back under. The morning broke clear, the kind that made the prairie shine gold. But peace never lasts long in a land still scarred by violence. Jesse had just finished splitting wood when the sound of hooves rose from the ridge. He straightened, axe still in hand, watching as a column of soldiers rode down into his yard. Dust rose around them, their rifles glinting in the sun, their faces hard with the weight of duty. The girl stepped onto the porch, the quilt still around her shoulders, and froze as their eyes turned to her. Jesse felt her body go rigid, even from a distance, the fear rolling off her like smoke. The officer at the front dismounted, a man with sharp features and a voice that carried authority. He said they were hunting survivors from a raid on a wagon train, the kind of bloodshed that left no mercy behind. He looked straight at the girl, his tone heavy with suspicion, and asked Jesse if he knew who he was harboring. Jesse's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the axe handle, though his voice stayed calm as he answered. He said she was no bandit, no outlaw, only a soul near dead when he found her by the river. The officer glanced between them, his eyes narrowing, as though he weighed Jesse's words against the rumors he had carried across miles. Another soldier muttered that she matched the description of a girl seen with the raiders, dirt on her dress and fire in her eyes. The girl's head dropped low, her hands gripping the quilt tight, as if it might shield her from the judgment she had fled. Jesse stepped closer, his stance wide, his voice firm, saying she had harmed no one since the day he found her. He would not hand her over like a thief in the night. The officer's mouth hardened. He told Jesse that sheltering her could brand him a traitor, that the law did not look kindly on men who took in strays from bloodied roads. The girl trembled, tears falling silent down her cheeks, her breath shaking as she turned her face away. She believed it now, believed she had cursed the only man who had ever stood for her, believed that her shadowed past would drag him into ruin. She pressed her hands against her face to stop the sobs, but Jesse saw the way her shoulders shook. He stepped forward until he stood between her and the soldiers, his voice steady as he told them they would find no outlaw here, only a woman broken by the cruelty of others. The officer studied him a long moment, then gave a sharp nod to his men. They mounted again, their eyes still burning with doubt, and left with the promise they would return if proof showed otherwise. The yard grew quiet, the dust settling, the echo of hooves fading into the hills. Jesse turned then, his face softening as he looked at the girl huddled on the porch. She whispered through her tears that he should have left her at the river, but he shook his head, saying plain and simple that no shadow she carried would make him regret pulling her from the water. Her tears fell heavier at that, not from fear this time, but from the weight of being seen when she thought she was beyond saving. The river moved slow under the weight of twilight, its surface catching the red of the sinking Sunday. Jesse had not planned to return there, yet fate carried him back to the very place where he had first lifted the girl from the water. They had fled the cabin when word spread that soldiers were closing in again, but the prairie offered little cover, and soon the sound of hooves surrounded them. Jesse reined his horse to a halt at the bank, his jaw set tight, knowing there was no more running. The girl slid from the saddle, her eyes wide as the line of blue coats appeared through the trees, rifles gleaming, voices sharp with command. She clutched Jesse's arm for a moment, her body trembling, then let go, her breath shallow, as though the river itself threatened to pull her under once more. The officer rode forward, the same man who had warned Jesse before. His face carried the hard certainty of someone convinced of his own justice. He pointed at the girl and said she was to be taken, that survivors of the wagon raid would answer for blood spilled, that Jesse could step aside and be spared trouble. Jesse stood tall, his hand firm as he lifted the rifle from his saddle. He leveled it across the water's glow, his voice carrying clear and strong. He said no law written in suspicion would claim her, no accusation without proof would bind her hands, and no fear in uniform would decide her worth. The words rolled out of him like fire, sharper than any bullet, and for the first time the soldiers hesitated. The girl shook beside him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her chest. But when Jesse planted his boots at the river's edge, she found herself moving too. Her legs wavered, her knees weak, but she stepped forward until she stood just behind his shoulder. The officer barked at her to surrender, but she raised her chin, though her body trembled. She had been nameless, mocked, accused, but in that moment she was something more. She was someone who would not let Jesse stand alone. The soldiers shifted in their saddles, the river running silent between them all. One young man at the back muttered that she did not look like a raider, his voice uncertain, but the officer snapped at him to hold his tongue. Jesse kept his rifle steady, his eyes burning with the same calm fire that had carried him through war and loss. He told them they could try to drag her away, but they would have to face him first, and he would not yield. The girl laid her hand on his arm then, her fingers shaking, but her voice breaking free for the first time in strength. She said she would not be taken, not again, not by men who saw only what they wanted to see. The river carried her words across the silence, and the soldiers faltered. The officer's mouth tightened, his pride stung, but even he knew the truth of the moment. To seize her now would not be justice but cruelty plain to the eye. At last he spat into the dirt, ordered his men to turn back, and rode away with bitterness clinging to his shoulders. The dust of their departure hung long in the air, but when it cleared, the girl was still standing at Jesse's side, her hand on his arm, her breath ragged yet unbroken. Jesse lowered his rifle slowly, the weight of victory heavy in his chest. She leaned into him then, not to hide, but to steady herself, and though her body trembled she had stood, and that truth would not be washed away by any river. The night lay heavy after the soldiers rode off, their hoofbeats fading into the dark hills and leaving behind only the slow whisper of the river. Jesse built a fire on the bank, the flames rising steady against the cool wind, and the girl sat across from him, her hands wrapped tight around the blanket, as if it alone could hold her together. Neither spoke for a long while. The crackle of wood and the distant cry of a night bird filled the silence, but beneath it was something heavier, something that still pressed between them from the stand they had just made. Her eyes were wide and uncertain, glancing often toward him, then back to the ground, as though she could not decide if she should be ashamed for what danger she had brought, or proud that she had not turned away when it came. Jesse leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, the firelight cutting across his weathered face. He studied her not with suspicion, but with a quiet kind of care. He saw the way her lips trembled, the way her shoulders shook, even as she tried to hold herself still, and he knew the weight she carried was not only from the soldiers, but from every voice that had spoken against her since the river. At last he spoke, his voice calm and steady, telling her she need not carry their names. He said the river had washed the old one away, whatever it had been, whatever shame had clung to it, and from this night she would be called Grace. Because that was what had saved her, And that was what she was. She lifted her head at the word, her breath catching, as if the sound itself had broken through some wall inside her. Grace. It settled on her chest like a burden and a gift all at once, heavy with meaning, yet light with possibility. She had been mocked as nameless, accused of guilt she could not untangle, but now here was a name given not out of scorn but out of mercy. She trembled as she whispered it once, barely letting the sound escape her lips, as though afraid it might vanish if spoken too loud. Grace. The word quivered in the air, fragile but real. Jesse nodded slow, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time since he had found her, she felt seen, not as a shadow of the past, but as someone who might belong to the future. She smiled then, small and unsteady, but true. It was the kind of smile that came not from joy alone, but from survival, from realizing there was still something left inside her worth claiming. She pressed the blanket closer, her eyes wet with tears she did not try to hide, and looked at him with a gratitude that needed no words. The fire burned warmer between them, the river flowing quiet as if bearing witness. She whispered the name again, this time not as a question but as her own, Grace. And with that single word the world shifted, not into perfection, not into safety, but into something she had never known before, a place where she could begin again. Jesse leaned back, his face softened by the firelight, and for the first time since he had lifted her from the water, he let himself believe they might both find peace here. The seasons turned slow, carrying with them the rhythm of days that began to feel less like survival and more like living. The girl, who had once been silent and broken by the river, grew into someone Jesse barely recognized, though he watched every change with quiet pride. She learned to ride under his patient hand, first clutching the reins so tight her knuckles whitened, then easing as the horse carried her steady across the prairie. She laughed the first time the animal splashed through shallow water, a sound so bright Jesse almost stopped riding just to hear it again. The fear that once wrapped around her began to loosen, each mile teaching her she had more strength than she ever believed. At the cabin she took to mending clothes and cooking simple meals, her hands growing sure where once they trembled. She asked Jesse to show her how to split wood, how to patch the roof, how to read the sky for storms, and though he teased her for wanting to do every task, he showed her all the same. He saw the light in her eyes each time she learned something new, and he knew it was not the work itself that mattered, but the dignity she found in being able to stand on her own feet. By spring she planted seeds in the rich soil near the river, kneeling in the earth with determination, her fingers dark with dirt and hope. She called it their garden, though she knew it was more than that, for it grew on the very bank where Jesse had lifted her from death. She claimed the ground as theirs, a place not of sorrow but of beginning. When the first shoots broke through, she touched them with wonder, as if proof that she too could rise again. The townsfolk still whispered when they came for supplies, but she no longer bowed her head. When asked her name she spoke it plain, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. Grace Hale, she said, and the sound of it carried weight. Not a name of shame, not a mockery, but a truth she had chosen and claimed. People raised their brows, some with scorn, some with respect, but she did not waver. Jesse stood beside her each time, his silence as firm as any vow. The river that once held her like a coffin now shimmered as the heart of her home. She and Jesse fished its waters, washed clothes along its edge, and sat at dusk, watching the sun sink beyond its curve. She often thought of the night he named her, how the firelight had caught the strength in his eyes, and she knew he had given her more than a word. He had given her a place in the world, a life no river could wash away. One evening as summer waned, she stood barefoot in the garden, her hair loose in the breeze, and looked back at Jesse where he sat on the porch. She smiled, not with hesitation but with ease, and in that moment she felt whole. Grace Hale, once nameless, now belonged not only to him, not only to the land, but to herself. And in the steady presence of the cowboy who had given her a name, she had found the rarest thing the wild country could offer: a home beside the river. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.